have an incredible guest with us today, who is Shannon Rivers. And Shannon was born and raised in the Gila River Indian community, which is located in the southern state of Arizona, in the United States. For nearly 10 years, Mr. Rivers was a delegate and a participant at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, held at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And in 2008, he was selected as co-chair for the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus and held that seat for 2 consecutive years. He is currently a cultural liaison with the Indian Health Center in San Jose and is a Native American cultural and spiritual leader and advisor to the indigenous inmate populations at county, state, and federal prisons in both Arizona and California, providing spiritual and traditional guidance and healing to incarcerated Native men and women. And he holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Northern Arizona University and a Master's in American Indian Studies from the University of California, Los Angeles. Lastly, Shannon is a cultural ambassador for the O'odham Peoples Nation of the 4 O'odham Nations located in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. And today's talk, when we were discussing it, Shannon shared with me that since this is such a water-themed day, that he would love to focus on his own history and story of water, which is also the story of, as you will learn or imagine, much deprivation and theft and impact and loss for his people. So his keynote presentation here, whenever he speaks, he always really shares a lot of varied critical insights and heartfelt insights. And so I'm really pleased to introduce Shannon Rivers to tUrn Week. Thank you so much for being with us, Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Just good to see everybody. I'm going to share my screen here in a minute, but I want to introduce myself traditionally, and that is by acknowledging who I am. Again, my English name, my colonized name is Shannon Rivers. That name is a colonized name, which comes, as you can see, I'm not Irish. I'm Akamir O'odham. I'm from the river people, and today I'm 54 years old, and I love life, but I've had a chance to kind of examine my life. My degree at Northern Arizona University was focused on the science and the ecology of Northern Arizona and its climate. But today I wanted to talk about how I grew up. And I grew up on a reservation, the Gila River, and people usually say Gila, but it's Gila. And Gila is a Spanish term. So my last name, Rivers, was actually Rivera. And I'll tell you when and how that changed through my slide. Most of us have Spanish or English names, and that's because of settler colonialism. And so for me, I want to focus a little bit on not only the history of my people, but the history in which how it translated with settler colonialism, economics, deprivation, and even the loss of life among my people, and continues to be. The Gila River Indian community is an interesting community in that we are not a treaty tribe. We are an executive order tribe, meaning that we agreed at the time to stay on the land of which we're from. And I'm going to share my slide or my presentation with you now. And if you guys can you see that? I want to talk a little bit about where I'm from. And as you can see, this is a map of Arizona. Arizona is actually an O'odham word, Arizona. Ari means a place of a lot of little streams. And if you look at kind of the lower center of the map here, you can see the Gila River Indian community. And then above that, you see the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, Achin, and then Tono O'odham, right? So we are all O'odham. We kind of, the Salt River is members of the Gila River Indian community, but they moved a little to the north to the Salt River area because the Gila River itself had dried up by then. And they moved probably maybe about 100 years ago or so. So that, and the rest of the tribes you see here, nations are about 21 nations within the state of Arizona. You see Navajo Nation up at the top, the Hopi, the Apache and the San Carlos, Zuni, Pascua, and then of course this ridge here that you see on the far to your left is the border of Arizona and California, but that is the Colorado River itself. Remember, the Colorado River used to go into areas of Mexico, but because it's being dammed up or been dammed up, it doesn't reach that area. So the ecosystem down at the bottom or toward Mexico is now no longer really existing, meaning that a lot of the flora and the fauna there are no more, they're not growing anymore. This is a map of my tribe, the Gila River Indian community as we see it today. It's roughly about 620 square miles. And as you can see, it has grids, right? Each of those grids are districts. Part of the Dawes Act was for us as Native people to get land. If you can imagine that we were reduced down to 7 districts in our community. District 7 is members of the Pipash or the Maricopa, which were a human tribe, which came to our territory probably about 100 years ago because of some fighting and some tribal issues that they had with the rest of the human tribes in that area. Those battles or wars at that time. So what you see here is the 7 districts. I live in District 5, or that's where I'm from. And why is that significant? Because District 5 itself holds one of the oldest areas of what we call, we don't call it District 5, it's Vaki in our language. So all of these are colonial names that we have to abide by within the government. We are not restricted. We can move out of that. We can live and go wherever we want. But remember, this is a reservation, and I said that earlier that we are a unique tribe, meaning that at the time of our establishment and our executive order, we were given a choice. We were given a choice as Native people to move because the river was being dammed up and loss of life was very extreme. We were given a choice to move to Oklahoma. In fact, many Native people were given a choice at that time to move to Oklahoma, which would be the center or which would be an area which they would keep many, many Native people. And it would become the largest reservation in the country. So that symbol there that you see, the Gila River Indian community, it talks about we were established in 1939 as a reservation. These signs you'll see all over the community. It lets non-Native people know that you are entering the reservation and that there's jurisdictions that you have to abide by. There are some areas on the reservation where non-Indians cannot go. And those are typically reservation sacred sites, and we have many, many of those. They're all over Phoenix. Unfortunately, they're being desecrated through expansion and development. This is a picture of the river. The river once, we were told that it once was probably a mile wide at some point. Now it's probably, that's more like 30 feet. And rarely do you see water in it. Some people say, well, the river is dead. We don't say that, of course. The river is alive. There's just no water. And in 1930, President Coolidge finally dammed it up and completed the dam of the Gila River, eliminating any water source to Gila River Indian community residents. And I want to give a little history. This here is kind of the history of, most of your students will know this, the Gadsden Purchase and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But I want you to look at the wording. What I wrote on top is Akamir Oatam Juvat. Juvat means the land or the territory. Remember, we're not as Oatam people, we don't see just the land as being where we're at now, where we have reservation. This is our whole land. Phoenix is our land. Tucson is our land. Tucson is actually an Oatam word. You say Chukshan. Chukshan means Black Mountain in our language. So what I'm telling you here, and what I'm sharing with you here, is about, and I want you to either think about this when we're talking throughout this lecture, is the idea of renaming, and which happens in colonial situations. I'm in San Jose. I'm sure that the Ohlone Wamekwa tribe didn't call it San Jose. I'm sure that when we go to Santa Cruz, that they didn't, the Amamutsin or the Ohlone people or the Coastal Miwok didn't call it that either. So I want you to understand that names really are important. My name, as I mentioned earlier, is a colonial name. My Indian name, if I were to tell you my Indian name, I would have to kill you, and I don't want to do that. I'm kidding, of course, but that's an Indian joke. So relax, youngsters. But I want you to look at this word and this statement. When the U.S., quote, acquired Arizona in 1853 through the Gadsden Purchase, the supply of water was greatly diminished. This was due to the building of dams amid rerouting waters from the Gila River to more populous settlements. Populous settlements. These were settlements that were non-native settlements, Spanish settlements, and white settlers coming through. And remember, about this time, there were a lot of white Americans coming through the country. And around this time, gold was discovered in California. And so a lot of people were traveling through in that our territory. And so again, this was due to the building of dams aimed to rerouting water from the Gila River to more populous settlements outside Native American reservations. This idea that somehow that we don't get water, our water is taken. The question that we have to ask is, who gives that authority, and where does that authority come from, right? As a result, the Pima Indians, they called us Pima Indians. Pima is a derogatory term that really comes from a Spanish word that means Pimos. My understanding was at the very beginning of our connection and our relationship with settler societies. Remember, most Americans in high school are learned about the Atlantic slave trade, and they only know the Eastern Coast history. But if you go throughout the United States, and especially in the Southwest, our relationship started long before we had white settlers in our territory. So we had Spanish coming up from the South. And so they called us Pimas or Pimos, and they called our territory the Pimaria. But we were Akamir O'atam, or we were O'atam people. We were Tono O'atam. I don't believe that we were, even at that time, we distinguished ourselves as reservation Indians. We were O'atam people, or O'atam individuals. Akamir O'atam, Tono O'atam, Hiachet O'atam, and Onkakamir O'atam. Salt River people, the river people, the desert people, and the sand people in Mexico. So we didn't distinguish ourselves. But it says, as a result, the Pima were deprived of their critical water supply and were forced to abandon their agricultural lifestyle. So what does that mean then? So if you have a nation or a tribe living near a water source, who had lived there for thousands and thousands of years and lived off that ecosystem, planted corn, squash, beans, and melons, and hunted mule deer and whatever else was in that area, you dramatically change not only their lifestyle, their ecosystem, but what they eat. And so for us as Native people, as O'atam, we were some of the first people to receive government rations, government foods. How many of you heard of commodity cheese? Or maybe some of you are too young, but you heard it had canned pork and canned this, canned beans, lard, something that we didn't know. But so anyway, my point to that is that we had a dramatic shift in our lifestyle. And so, and I'll share some more information about that. So we became, over that period of time, probably from 1870 to 1860 or 1960, within that time, we became, we not only, a lot of our people died because of the lack of water or resources, but they became dependent on cultural foods or colonial foods that were not we couldn't adapt to. And so, and because of that, we became diabetic, and we became diabetic, and the largest diabetic tribe in the country, with over 50% of our members having diabetes. So this, I want you to understand. We talk about, I think Catherine earlier, when she read the land acknowledgement, we talk about settler colonialism and the legacy of settler colonialism. All of you, like me, are settlers in these areas. We do not come from these areas, not unless you're a Ohlone or Miwok or Muwekma. I'm a settler. I have an office here in San Jose. I'm downtown, and I recognize that I'm a settler. So Indigenous peoples' history of settler colonial legacy, the settler colonial legacy, commencing with the doctrines of discovery, patterns of domination, is directly connected to the present genocidal forms of environmental conditions of the state. The economic, political, and cultural violence perpetuated against the Indigenous peoples and their respective First Nations. Indeed, the doctrine of discovery is one of the clearest expressions of the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. And why do I say that? Why is that important? How many of you heard of the doctrine of discovery? Anybody? Kristen? Yeah. So, and a couple of folks. But the doctrine of discovery, how many of you heard of the manifest destiny? Yeah. You ever see the picture of manifest destiny? You can Google it, and you can Google that picture, and it'll show a white lady floating in the air, and she's holding a book, and I believe it's the Bible. And it's a painting that was done many years ago. But at the bottom of her feet, and I would encourage you to Google it. At the bottom of her floating, there's an image of white people moving westward expansion in the United States, settler colonialism. The doctrines of discovery play a major role in that. And so at the bottom of her feet, you'll see on one side as the movement of settler colonials moving west, but in the front of her, what you'll see is Indian people, native people, and animals running from her. That's kind of interesting, right? Why are they running? You got to ask yourself, why are they running? And so the relationship between the doctrine of discovery, and that's really critical for those of you that are in college and universities, and you're going to go into, maybe you're a history major, maybe you're a law major, you're seeking your law degree, or you're going to fight against the environment. What you're going to find out that the laws at the highest level of the Supreme Court are still directed and through and connected to this idea of the doctrine of discovery, that native people do not own the land. They are simply allowed to live on the land. So you have a population once of native people in the United States, roughly about maybe 125 million. That's a guesstimate. You're talking Canada, United States, and northern parts of Mexico. That all of a sudden in the United States, we have a population of about 6 million left. So settler colonialism not only perpetuated that violence, but the disappearance of native people. But I want you to look at the term connected to the present genocidal forms of environmental conditions. Those are critical. Those are something that we have to look at as native people and try to understand how it impacts us. Now, this is really important. I don't know if I shared this with you guys before. Have I shared this with you, Kristen? Do you remember?
With me, yes, but I'm not sure. I don't know if people here came to your talk last year. So
yeah. So this stuff doesn't really change. How many of you have been watching the news lately and you see the change of the Department of Interior with our new Department of Interior, who is Native American, Representative Deb Haaland, Congresswoman Deb Haaland, is now the new director of the Department of Interior. During the 1800s, the Department of Interior's motto was to kill the Indian, or kill the Indian and save the man. That meant to assimilate them as much as possible. That meant to cut their hair, to not let them speak their language. So the reason this is important is because if you take away everything from an individual, if I went to your house and sat on your couch, you would probably call the police and say, Shannon doesn't want to leave. But that's the idea of settler colonialism, is that you come along and you take, and I eat your food, and I use your bathroom, and I take showers, and I use your water, and I use all the amenities you have. You wouldn't like that, right? You'd probably try to kick me out. But the reality is that's what happened with Native people. And I want to go through these one by one and talk about them a little bit. According to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, there are roughly 380 million indigenous peoples remaining in the world. Of that, 60 to 70% of the world's untouched waters, forest, pristine ecosystems remain in their care. So why is that important? Well, if you look at the South and you look at the Amazon, you got people like Chevron, people that want to large farming industries, cattle industries that are destroying thousands and thousands of trees and burning trees and destroying the Amazon so that the world can eat meat, if you can imagine. How many of you eat meat? I eat meat once in a while, and I love a burger. Don't lie. I know it's some of us love that In-N-Out, right? But the reality is that in order for you to think of this in a global system, is that if you got 60% of the world's untouched waters and forests and pristine ecosystems held in their care, indigenous peoples, you're not just talking South America and Central America. You're talking about regions in the Central Africa. You're talking about island territories. You're talking about the Sami indigenous peoples way up north through Russia and Finland and Sweden and Norway. So you got these ecosystems of untouched waters. And so these people are protecting them. Do you think these indigenous people have armies? No, more than likely they don't. Do you think that they are getting coerced into selling their land? Probably. But more than likely they're being forced to sell or to give up or to remove or to be removed. And unfortunately, a lot of indigenous peoples are moving to city areas, losing their cultural understanding of who they were. So I think that's really important for students like yourself to understand is that indigenous peoples remain the stewards of Mother Earth. The second point is indigenous peoples are among the first to face direct consequences of climate change, primarily due to their dependence upon an intimate relationship with the environment and its resources. Climate change exacerbates the difficulties already faced by vulnerable indigenous communities, including political, economic marginalization, loss of land and resources, human rights violations, racial discrimination, and unemployment. On my reservation, which I mentioned, is a unique reservation in that we have 3 casinos, and we just signed for a 4th one. We do not give per capita. That means, or we do, but it's very small. It's probably about $400 every 3 months, if that. That's the highest. Unemployment among the men is very high, and you'll find that in most reservations. Diabetes, heart disease, liver disease are very high in our communities. Most Native men will survive or live to 57 years of age if they grow up on a reservation. That's 24 years less than a white American, healthy American. 24 years. So I'm 54. I typically eat well. I do pretty well. I'm financially stable, but that's rare. It's a rare thing in Indian country. So I honor that, but I also am very aware of the economic poverty and the resource poverty that indigenous peoples face in reservations throughout the country. Point number 3, poverty contributes to a number of less than desirable environmental conditions that create increased stress and trauma. I want you to understand that the pandemic, this coronavirus, when it hit Indian country, it devastated many of our people. In fact, there's reports that Navajo Nation that I showed you in Arizona suffered 4 to 5 times higher the death rates of that of New York. And we know that New York was hit pretty hard. And those numbers still are not probably correct. Nevertheless, the stress upon and the trauma upon that, what do you think that does to a group of people? That creates more stress. If you're unemployed and you have this coronavirus, how do you eat? How do you get your resource? If your water is depleted and the animals are looking for water and you can't go hunting, and you can't water your fields? I mean, all of these things create stress and trauma. Approximately 26% of American Indians, Alaska Natives live in poverty. 26% compared to the 13% of the general population and 10% of the white Americans. Single parents, American Indian, Alaska Native families have the highest poverty rates in the country. And I want you to understand in that note that says 60 to 70% of Native populations live in urban areas. Why did they leave? I just mentioned earlier about the folks in the Amazon. We see many indigenous peoples. In fact, by 2050, we'll see that most people will live in city or urban areas because of their climate has been disrupted. Some islands are being overrun because of the rising ocean tides in the Pacific. We see that happening throughout the world. We see typhoons, we see fires. We see fires here in California. So if you can imagine that indigenous peoples have been facing climate disasters and due to political and economic forces, these human resources or the human rights violations and racial discrimination of indigenous peoples is a continuation that goes on today, right? Indigenous peoples who choose are forced to migrate away from the traditional lands, like myself and like my father. My father stayed on the reservation. He actually worked the land. He was a farmer. But the reality is that he didn't get paid much. I remember one time looking at his check, and it was $150 for every 2 weeks. And you had me, you had my sister. She ate more than everybody. I'm kidding, but I love my sister. You had my 3 older brothers. You had my 4 uncles whose mom died and my mom took care of them. And you had quite a number of people in that house, and my dad was the only economic life source. So he had to feed all of our mouths. Commodity foods was what saved us, if you will. Saved us in a way that we could eat. The truck would come once a month, the commodity food truck. We would run to the community center and we would load up our vehicles as much as possible with the food that we would give it. So the reality is that most people, and I want you to understand that 60% of that urban Native folks living in urban settings are young populations, about your age or maybe between 60, 55 and younger. Most of them have left the reservation because there was no economic benefit there. So we see that happening quite often. Is most Native people, and especially our Native people, is a young population, not only in Gila River, not only in Navajo Nation, but throughout Indian country. So that we see a lot of people moving to the city. And then, you know, and I want to read this, indigenous peoples who choose are forced to migrate away from their traditional lands, often face double discrimination, both as a migrant. Can you imagine that we are migrants in our own country? And as indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples may be more vulnerable to irregular migration, such as trafficking and smuggling. And I want you to understand the word trafficking, that we have a crisis today with murdered and missing indigenous women throughout the country. And that indigenous women are forced into, that disappear. And many of them are forced into trafficking and smuggling. Owning to sudden displacement by climate events, limited legal migration options, and limited opportunities to make informed choices. Deforestation, particularly in developing countries, is pushing indigenous families to migrate to cities for economic reasons and are often urban slums. So I want to take a break here and ask if you have any questions, because I'm going to go into just a couple of more slides and then we'll finish up. But do we have any questions? And that allows me to take a drink. So. I know it's a lot of information. It's a lot. Madeline?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I just want to thank you so much for your presentation. And I loved in the beginning, you sort of mentioned that you have a degree in sort of climate related science and you have experiences there, but you found it, you talked about a love of life and sort of the importance of looking at your life and sharing your life story. And it reminded me of a question I get a lot of times from students about when I talk about internalized oppression. And a lot of times they wonder like whether looking at the nature of oppression or whether looking at the depth of discouraging realities that there are will in some ways will impede them in their journey towards liberation. And I wonder if you I have my own way of answering that question, but I wonder what you do when you encounter that resistance to reality, I guess.
No, that's so interesting that you bring that question up, because last night I had a dinner and with a colleague of mine, and her mom is 97, and she could probably run past me, and I was just like, wow, this woman was but my colleague's husband just finished his dissertation on internalized oppression. There's a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If you want to take a look at it, and I asked you to write it down. It's by a name by, I believe it's Paulo Freire is his name, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's a great book, and I encourage your students to read it, and you have to read it several times to get it. But I think for Indigenous peoples like myself, who left the reservation because I had really no choice. I mean, I was going to continue to drink or continue to do drugs or end up in prison, like most of my friends, most of my buddies who, or death was pretty common in our community. When I look back at my life, I mean, not like I'm 97 years old, but when I look back as a middle-aged Native man, I always wonder like what would have happened. And when I go home, when I went home, when I first graduated, when I first got my degree at NAU, Northern Arizona University, and I see one of my colleagues on here, so thank you for joining, Emily. But when I first got my degree, my mom posted it on her wall, and she put it up, and then my uncle said to me, this internalized oppression, one of my uncles said, "So you think you're better than us?" And I was like, no, I don't. But his internalized oppression was that in the book of The Pedagogy of the Oppressed is about even the oppressed oppress their own, they become oppressors, right? And I wonder then if somehow that in that settler colonial oppression that we adopted as Native people and as people, not just as Native people, but as a society, that we talk down or we become oppressive to one another. And my family, my uncle, when he said that to me, it really hurt, right? Because I was really proud of having a degree. I'm the first one to have a degree, and I'm the first one to have a master's degree in my family. And since then, he hasn't really talked to me, right? Because he assumes that I'm better than him. And my focus was, I want to be better as a human being, but I also want to change society within the reservation. I want to change that oppressive ideas and those thoughts that are holding us back. Because a lot of our people, unfortunately, are not educated. As Kristen mentioned, that I'm a chaplain or a Native American spiritual leader in prison, and the majority of people that I see are Black and brown bodies, and they have been oppressed, and many of them don't know it, and they are serving life in prison because they killed someone, and it's typically a brown or black person that they kill. And they killed them for whatever reason, but their idea of manhood or machismo or warriorism, this idea that we get is so confused, a distorted moral narrative that this country faces, right? That we as indigenous peoples have to change everything. And me as an educated Native man, I had to change all my thought process, because if I didn't, I was remaining the oppressor. And even though my uncle still somewhat oppressed me in some way, somehow looked down upon me, I didn't look down upon him, because I understood that he was in a situation that have oppressed him for many, many generations. And it's not just him, it's the people there. And so I never act too good, if you will. I am educated. I still joke the same way. I still be my same self. But when we have these conversations that you were having here, I try to do my best to educate. So yeah, thank you for that question. I'm sorry that was a long answer. So I think these things are really important for you to understand. This here is the southern border of our territory. This is Akamir or Tono Autumn. This is the border wall. Remember, we talked about the Gaston Purchase? This is the border wall of the Tono Autumn. As you can see way off in the distance, that's headed in the direction, I believe, toward California. So here's this monstrosity, right? This idea that white settler colonialism wants to build a wall, right? And they build a wall in the middle of the desert, and it's attempting to keep people out. Remember that indigenous peoples in Mexico, people that are Guatemaltecos, Mixtecs, Zapotecs, coming toward the south or coming north, are looking for a quote unquote better life. Remember, as I talked about settler colonialism, it's not just here in the United States. The policies and the economic deprivation and the lifestyle that has changed because of settler politics. You're talking colonial politics, not only in Mexico, but in Central and South America and throughout the world. The French, the Dutch, the Europeans, the British, all of them have this kind of idea of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism destroys Mother Earth. It is a resource extractive kind of idea, capitalism. It destroys Mother Earth. And so this here is an idea of capitalism. So this means that this is our land. We keep you out. You can't cross this border, because if you do, you'll get arrested. You're trespassing, typically is what you get arrested for. Today, we see the Biden administration, and we see many, many people coming from the South. Well, why are they coming? You have to ask the question, why are people coming? It's usually because of a better life, economic depression. We see cartels running and taking over lands and territories, forcing people into slave labor, trafficking, smuggling. This is the distorted moral narrative of this country. And many of these people, brown and black, accepted this moral narrative. So I call you out today to check yourself. What is your gauge of morality? What is your idea of more? See, this wall we don't acknowledge. We cross right over. When the Border Patrol asks me, "Are you American citizen?" and I always tease people, and they get scared. And some of the Indians that are riding in the car with me, or we cross the border to go get some medicine or whatever to see our relatives on that side of the border, they say, "Are you American citizen?" I say, "No." And they go, "Well, what are you?" And I go, "I'm Akamir Autumn. You're standing on my land." And so that kind of pisses them off, and they don't know what to say, right? Because I challenge their notion of settler colonialism. And you have to do that as yourself. And the reason I tell you that for all of you that are here is that because you are young, you're going to have to make these dramatic changes. We're going to have to go to solar. We're going to have to go to wind. We're going to have to go back to the idea of Mother Earth. Somebody once asked one of my friends, a man who passed away and a great scholar, a great poetic man, his name was John Trudell. And he said they asked him, do you guys want to go back to the old ways? And he said, no, an elder told me there are no old ways, there are no new ways, there are ways of Mother Earth. And that if you don't live by see, Mother Earth will get rid of us. You see that in this pandemic, right? That we are the smallest of human beings. We are the smallest of the species. We are the only species that takes at least 10 to 20 years to learn how to survive. An animal, a young deer or a young lion can live on its own within a year, 6 months, and a bird can fly within a couple of weeks. So we are the most pitiful species. So we build walls and we put things up like this, and we think that somehow we are controlling the movement of people. This is a grainy picture, but this is in Arizona. This was a place called Quito Boquito. It is one of the only springs in the area that still function. And Trump, Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, wanted to build a wall. Remember that guy, that crazy guy, orange hair, orange face? He wanted to build the wall or continue the wall. And so the cactus that you see there is, we call it Hashan or saguaro cactus. Those are our relatives. Those are actually our protectors. So we haven't done a good job at protecting the saguaro. We are related to the saguaro. The saguaro is our relative, our ancient relative. They can grow up to 80 feet tall and they can live many, many years. And so for us, when we see this happening, this is devastating to us. What you see even in Arizona is you'll see devastating wildfires. If you can imagine, the desert is on fire. The desert itself is hot, and we know that. But there's a cycle. Ofelia Zepeda put out a book, When It Rains. It's a small book of a collection of poems. And she talked about her grandmother, talking to her grandmother as a young woman. And she said, Grandma, why do we pray for rain? Because the rains always come anyway. And the grandma said, yeah, but they come because we pray. These are the monsoons that happen during the summers of in Arizona and the Sonoran Desert. And so there's there's a relationship that we have with the environment. I come from the Gila River. The river is not dead. There's no water in it. But it is unfortunately taken the lives of many of my people, and the flora and the fauna there are very, very dry. It's very painful to see when I go home. I love that place. Again, the border wall. Can you imagine putting up a wall in the middle of the desert where there's nothing? There's nothing. There's everything. There's animals, there's birds, and they're like, what the hell is going on here? Right? I mean, I don't know if that's what animals say, but can you imagine? You're putting up a wall in the middle of the desert and literally to keep people out. Donald Trump called them racists and thieves. But I wonder, who are the racists? Who are the thieves? Who are the thieves of the land? That's not my people. And that's not the brown people that I know. They barely have anything to take. They barely have anything to take with them. That border wall is sad to look at. what was interesting is that recently a wind came through and it kind of devastated portions of that wall. Mother Earth itself doesn't care about a wall. Mother Earth will not prevent any human interaction. We are small, brothers and sisters. We are small compared to the other animals. There's a saying in Lakota. It says "metakiase." Metakiase means we are all related. You and I are related. I'm related to the birds and the plants. It sounds funny, but you know that's what the hippies were trying to do, and so the CIA gave them LSD. That's what the Black Panthers were trying to do, and the CIA gave them cocaine in the 80s. That's what the Indians were trying to do, and the American Indian movement tried to do. But they gave us alcohol, lard, and sugar, and they destroyed our systems. So you young people have a lot on your shoulder. You are the warriors, the ecological warriors that have to stand up for Mother Earth. You have to. If you think that getting coffee, getting your meat, getting your food when you go to, what do you got out here, Ralph's or Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, and you go get your food, you got to ask yourself, where's this food from? Who's picking my food? Who's delivering my food? Where do I get my strawberries from? Where do I get my lettuce from? Where do I get whatever? You have to ask these questions, brothers and sisters. What is your relationship to Mother Earth? What is your relationship? And I say it's metakiase, that we are all related. And that if you don't believe that, then you're foolish, then you're greedy, then you have the settler mind of colonialism. And you are the taker, you are the fat taker. The Lakota called the white people washishu when they started coming around. The term washishu doesn't mean white people. It means the one who takes the best meat. And for a long time, they have taken the best meat. And I don't just mean the meat of the buffalo, but the meat of Mother Earth, the plants and the animals. They depend on us. In fact, more than anything, we depend on them. So I want to thank you, Christine. I want to thank you, all of you who joined us. And thank you all for sitting with me. And I hope that somehow this lecture, this presentation, changes your mind about who you are. And it may not change you today. Shit, you're young. Sorry, I cussed. But it may not change your mind today. But tomorrow when you wake up and you drink that little water that you have, and you say, in the morning, you say, thank you for that water. Give thanks to the food. Give thanks to the water. When you wake up in the morning and you hear that dove cooing, tell it thank you. When you know and you set your alarm for the next day, that is faith that you're going to wake up. That is faith that you're going to see your friends the next day. So be strong, relatives. Be ecological warriors. And be the best you can. Thank you, Christine.